The American Theater Wing and the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts bring you the American Theater Wing's Guide to Careers in the Theater. This session, the musical bookwriter.
Hello, I'm Pia Lindström with the American Theater Wing, and with me is musical bookwriter Peter Stone. What's a book in the theater?
Well, a book belongs in the province of the musical. It's a play, but it's a special kind of play. It's a play that is written in collaboration with a composer and lyricist, be that two people or one or three people, which is also been my experience. But the fact is that the book is basically a portion of the creative music, a portion of the musical. We'll get into later about what part the book plays in musicals and how it started and where it came from and where I think it's going.
Why aren't you called a playwright?
Because together we are an author. We are three-thirds of an author in essence, and this specifies our job. We're a dramatist. Dramatist is fair.
So you're a dramatist who has to collaborate.
Yes.
And that's part of what a book writer does, is collaborate with the lyricist. Who else?
And the composer. Now, that there are several collaborations. The theater is a collaborative process anyway, but in the musical it's even more so, because the creative process, that is before any production takes place, involves a collaboration, which is not true with a straight play. There the author writes it, completes it, rewrites it, whatever, and then goes for a production. Here the three of them, or however many there are, the three disciplines work together, and it's very, very intricate. I've often compared it to a marriage because it's not just that you are getting together to give birth to something, but you have to learn how to live together, be honest without being destructive. How do you like my hat, dear? Well, right. Well, they play a song, you read a scene. One must be honest. One can't say, I don't like that song. You can, I think you can do better. Is good. There are ways to evolve a collaboration, but it's a very, very intricate thing, and it's not unlike a doubles team in tennis. That is to say, two great tennis players get together to play doubles, but until they've played together a long time, until they've learned each other's strengths and weaknesses and worked out a strategy, they really are never going to become a championship.
So you would never be a book writer alone?
Well, you can't be. I have written a book before there was a score, and I've written the book after there was a score, and neither one is very efficacious. It's not a good idea. 1776 turned out to be all right because there was a score, but it was a gigantic score that came down in length quite a bit. There were 26 songs that came down to 10, really. And that's the only one I ever did where I wrote a book after there was a score that worked out well. I've also written a book that the score was added to, and that's a very unhappy prospect, because what happens is that it's all involved in where songs go and how they're used in a musical. And the thing about the difference between, let's talk about the difference between playwriting and book writing for a minute, because it's quite germane to this. A musical book is 2 hours of story, like any play, but told in 1 hour. You only have 1 hour in which to do it. So economy and shortcuts and shorthand and invention is needed to keep your story, because the score takes up the other hour, more or less, and doesn't add much to the ongoing story. It's not supposed to. It's not its job. The point of the score is to punctuate emotionally, and to punctuate either with comedy, with romance, with any number of emotions, but that's what it's there to do, not to further the story. So that you have to, most playwrights sit down and they write a book, and they've got 2 hours of book, and then add to that another hour or so of score, and they end up with something that's unwieldy and probably unusable. The other difference between playwriting and book writing, which is even more important, is that book writing of a musical is really about two things. One is construction, and the other is I'll find the word in a minute, because I know it, because that's how I make my living. Concept.
Concept and construction. So somebody has a concept, that is an idea, for a book.
Beyond that, how to do it. It comes from the book, the concept of how to do it. And you need a concept, otherwise you are just telling a story, which sometimes it used to be the case where you told a story rather linearly, and you started, but it's gotten a little more intricate than that. And so, as an example, when I was asked to do the Will Rogers story some years ago, I was reluctant to do so. I didn't think his life was very interesting. His story is marvelous. He was the biggest star this country has ever and probably ever will produce. He was a gigantic force, politically, socially, and in many other ways in this country. When he died, unfortunately, in an accident, the country reacted not since Abraham Lincoln had there been such an outpouring of grief. He was a very, very important figure historically, but his life wasn't very interesting because he didn't have much drama in it, except for the way he left it, which was quite dramatic, his death, but otherwise. And there's no point inventing things, inventing marriages that didn't exist, girlfriends that didn't exist, any other bankruptcies that didn't exist. So in this case, I looked for a concept that allowed one to tell the story and make it entertaining. And it suddenly occurred to me that he was the biggest star of the Ziegfeld Follies. And Ziegfeld, if Ziegfeld told the story of Will Rogers, what would it sound like? And that's ultimately what we did. And so Ziegfeld keeps interrupting and changing things. He met his wife in a railroad station in Oklahoma, in a small town. Ziegfeld wouldn't stand for it. He said, no, they must have met somewhere more exotic, and it ended up they met on the moon in a rocket station. But it was the same scene, but it was done with spectacle and entertainment.
So you need imagination to be a
clearly
writer.
that, but you need to have a concept on how to tell this story.
And you need
I
a
actually
concept.
used that same concept when we just did Annie Get Your Gun, the revival. The story, Annie Get Your Gun, hasn't been done with probably the most blissful score ever written. It's just a remarkable score by Irving Berlin. But it hadn't been done in 55 years because the story was rather simple, and by today's dates, I use the word corny. I don't use it so pejoratively. It was simple, and a little too simple for today's stage. But it occurred to me that you couldn't, if we did it simply, it would be rather strange. But if Buffalo Bill, who was presenting this, did his version of it, it's quite like what we did on Will Rogers. And that seems to have worked, and that's...
Is it possible to learn how to do what you just described?
You can learn part of it. Part of it is learnable. The technical aspects of it, how to construct can be, that's the other half of it. Construction is really important, more so important even than a play, because you must construct a very, very intricate edifice here that on which to hang all of the other collaborations that go on in the theater. So this everyone says the dialogue. Well, the actors make that up as they go along. You know that. But the construction is really it.
And you can learn construction.
Yes.
What would you do to learn construction?
Well, there are musical, but there are dramatic courses. I went to the Yale Drama. There are other very good drama courses around. You can read plays. Actually, all you have to. The reason I got into musicals in the first place, I was a playwright. I was writing plays. I've not thought about it. I loved musicals. I went to them. I saw them all. But I did not see myself as doing that. And then an opportunity arose to do one for Broadway. And all I wanted to do was get on Broadway. And it also starred Alfred Drake, who at the time was arguably the greatest singer-actor of the stage, and it was a very attractive idea. It was based on a play by Sartre that I had seen when I lived in Paris, and it was so I did it. And I got hooked on it, and I actually didn't know how to do it. I went to Frank Lesser. Frank Lesser was a terribly talented, successful, and sophisticated man who was articulate enough to express how to do it. I go to say, where do songs go? How do you know when a song comes? How do you do this? How do you do that? And he was terribly, terribly helpful. And more than that, he was inspiring. But when I got through with the musical, though it was not the success we had hoped it was, it wasn't an abject failure, but it didn't turn out to be what we hoped, I was bitten. And what I was bitten by was I suddenly realized the straight play at that time, this is many, many years ago, just before the Civil War, you understand, when I was young. But the theater at that time, namely the straight play, was still immersed in naturalism, in realism and naturalism. And naturalism was a kind of a dead-end thing. It was very important when it came along as part of the great social revolutions of the 19th century and even the end of the 18th century. And it talked about social things. Ibsen talks about the water supply and venereal disease and all these social problems of the time. Although he was a master playwright and the plays are wonderful, they dealt with social problems. And so it went on through the 20s in this country and the 30s and the great social upheavals in the plays. And it seemed to be a dead end. The fact of the audience sitting there as eavesdroppers with the fourth wall being transparent and seeing reality on the stage. I'm a great believer. All through my school studies and afterwards, I became a great, great devotee of Aristotle's Poetics. And present company accepted, he was the only critic I know of who was really spectacular. And he talks about the properties of theater, and there were 6, not 3. And naturalism and straight play handle 3, plot, character, and theme. But he mentions 3 more: poetry, movement, namely dance, and spectacle. And those 3 things exist in the musical theater, which did not exist anywhere else. Poetry used to be part of the straight theater. The spectacle and movement used to be part of it. But with realism, it went away. With naturalism, all those things went. The conventions of the theater, things like soliloquies. And then when Freud came along, a person standing alone talking to himself, you'd put a net around him, which was not the point. You were just expressing inner thoughts. But still, it was a great jump for an audience. But I think it's no accident that one of the greatest pieces of musical theater ever written is called Soliloquy in Carousel. And the conventions came back through the musical.
You mentioned a musical by Sartre.
No, it was a straight play that he wrote called
Sartre.
Kean, about the life of Edmund Kean, the great actor, and we turned it into a musical.
I see.
And so I think that I became devoted to the musical because it opened up a way of telling stories that didn't exist at the time. Then when the so-called theater of the absurd, when Beckett and Ionesco and Albee and all the rest came along and helped destroy naturalism, it became even more possible in the straight play. But then by then, to do the things that were necessary for me were too expensive to do. Spectacle was too expensive in a straight play. Movement and dance and poetry, all of that became too complicated for straight plays. So I became a musical person because that was the way I wanted to express myself.
What sort of a person do you think goes into your line of work?
Well, someone obviously, you have to be mad to start. Well,
Okay, mad.
In this sense. Most people say, well, I don't want to collaborate. I want to do my own work. They misunderstand what this collaboration is. It's not really a collaboration as a playwright. It's a collaboration as an author, a different situation. Nobody writes your book but you. Nobody does your work but you, no more than you do the music or the lyrics. So it's a collaboration of disparate parts, which are then put together into a whole, but you are not collaborating on playwriting.
Right.
You're doing that. So that's the first thing. You've got to understand the nature of collaboration. Also, you've got to understand the differences between the straight theater and the musical theater, which we've been talking about.
And what other attributes? What kind of people? What are the qualities a person would need?
Well, it's also, to talk about it, it's also somewhat thankless because all one hears about with the great musicals, and I've had 15 productions on Broadway, and all one hears about, I mean, is I wrote the Julie Stein show, and I wrote the Richard Rodgers show. I worked with him. I wrote all these shows were the press, frankly, in the New York press and all around. When I see reviews around the country, the New York critics are pretty good about it, but not the columnists, but the critics. But around the country, it's the composer's show.
The composer is more well known.
It's not about even well known. It could be his first show, but it's the musical belongs to the composer. So you have to realize that you're not going to be credited with what you've done very much. But if
so
that matters to
you don't have to have a big ego to do this. You mean you can have a normal-sized ego?
Well, you need a big ego to do it, but what you need is some kind of governor on it, something that says, look, this isn't why you're doing it. You're not doing it to become a household word because you never will. You're not doing it, for, the kind of fame and fortune that can come is very important within the community you work in. What do you care? Right. Do I really care if anybody in Cincinnati has ever heard of me? No, of course not. Do I care if anybody in New York has ever heard of me? Yes, I do.
In the theater community,
yes,
they
which
know.
matters because the rest of it doesn't matter.
Right.
They don't know the name in Cincinnati. They don't know the name of Tony Kushner, so
right.
Who's a great playwright. So why should they know a book writer? So you have to do that. Secondly, there is still, even though the nature of the musical book has changed radically in terms of its importance to the show, you are still doing half the work for a third of the pay. The royalties are still split 2/3 to the composer and lyricist, 1/3 to the book writer, even though the book writer is in most cases producing at least 50 and maybe more, 50% of the finished product. That's an inequity that exists. It's very hard to overcome. Naturally, composers and lyricists don't want to overcome it, and so it's there.
But it must offer you something because, as you said, you've done all these productions.
You still, I mean, if the show works, there's plenty to go around. But still, it's upsetting. The musicals used to be in the teens, 20s, and 30s a score-driven operation. That is to say, the music. It was about music, basically. And the books followed the score around. They were rather insipid, clever. The dialogue was good, but the stories were foolish or less. I mean, for instance, a weekend guest house party in Connecticut. That's it, period.
But they're not so foolish today. We have some very serious musicals.
Oh, it's quite different. It's quite different. That was what it was until Oscar Hammerstein invented the musical book, really, as we know it now. He invented it single-handedly. His greatest, he was a wonderful lyricist, but he was a spectacular book writer in terms of inventing it. He invented it, literally invented it, and the musical was never the same. And starting around the time of Oklahoma, although he had some thing to do also with Showboat, but starting with Oklahoma and Carousel and King and I and so forth, the musical changed, and it became book-driven. The score now follows the book around because the story, the characters, the conflict, all of that is what makes a musical work. A musical can work with a so-so score and a wonderful book. The musical will work. A musical will not work if it has a wonderful score and a so-so book. It won't work. And so it's really
so it's very important.
Very, in certain ways. Obviously, it's about musical numbers and it's about songs.
Well, that's a concert if you just have a series of musical numbers.
But the book is now what drives the musical. So the idea that it's a third share, but that's more something for your agent more than for your...
So what would you advise someone to study if they thought perhaps they had an inclination toward being a musical book writer?
Well, there are things you can learn and things you can't. Like in most disciplines in the theater, although some of the more mechanical ones can be learned and quietly. The musical is an animal that is rewritten more than it's written. And you and I were talking earlier about the importance of the road. That is to say, to try a show out of town before it comes into New York. I've never had a show that didn't undergo massive, massive change out there. Because once you put, for one thing, the collaboration I mentioned between the composer, the lyricist, and the book writer then grows. Then you get a director, a choreographer, and a producer, which is the next, and they're very, very important. And
Well,
so
there isn't anything you can study to learn these things.
No, you can't.
How do you learn
then
them?
Then the collaboration grows again. The scenic designer, the costume designer, the sound designer, all of the other elements of the design team, plus the orchestrator and the orchestra leader and the. So pretty soon you're dealing in around 12, 14 people have joined that collaboration. One never sees the musical put together till you get the first production in front of an audience. You haven't seen it under the lights, you haven't seen it with the costumes, you haven't seen it on the sets, you haven't heard the orchestra under it, you haven't seen it. Mm-hmm. You can guess at it. And in what happens in rehearsal is all sorts of things that please you and get everybody laughing, and it turns out usually not to be translated into an audience. But you put it in front of an audience with these elements which you've never seen before, and you are surprised. You are beyond surprised. You're shocked. And to be able to withstand that shock and not go into instant depression and be carried off, with a tag on your toe is almost, you have to learn that. And you learn it by doing it. And you learn musical more than any other thing, and that goes for the book writer, it goes for everybody, is learned by doing it.
I see.
And, how do I get to do it? You have to do it.
You have to become an apprentice, perhaps, somewhere.
Well, that's very important, to get onto a show, even as an intern, even as a gopher, to watch the process and to see what happens. It is now, one of the great dangers to musicals is this reluctance to go out of town, because it's very expensive and you lose a lot of money.
I think you were quoted once as saying a book writer has to like trouble out of town.
If you don't like getting into trouble out of town, stay out of this job. But I'm a puzzle doer. I like, you're in trouble in a crossword puzzle, you're in trouble in a jigsaw puzzle, you're in trouble. You've got trouble. And working it out, it's the solving of it, which is very rewarding and kind of fun, as long as nobody's running around, screaming that the sky's falling, which it is, by the way.
Tell me about the fun part.
Well,
what's
the
fun
about
about
is seeing
this?
it get better every day.
I see.
I was out on a show and I was working with Sammy Kahn and Jimmy Van Heusen, who were two wonderful songwriters who had not been in the theater that much. They had, especially Sammy, had done a couple of shows. Jimmy hadn't. They had written one. They wrote mostly for Sinatra. They wrote for Hollywood. They had hits after hit after hit. And we were out of town in Detroit, and they were going mad because the show wasn't really getting any better in their eye. And they finally decided to grab the director, who happened to also be the producer, in the lobby during a matinee, and just say, "That's it. We've had it. Close it. Put it out of its misery." And the director said, "Just a minute," before he talked to them. He turned to his secretary and said, "The ballad is a tad slow. Pick up the tempo on the ballad." And this really drove them off the wall. They said, "The ballad is too slow. The show is in the John, and you're telling me you're trimming the fingernails of a corpse, for God's sake. Stop this." And he said, "Listen to me and get it right. Tomorrow the ballad will be right." And that's all you can hope for. Every day. You can't fix it in one day, and you can't fix it in 1 week, but you can fix one thing, 2 things, 5 things at a time, in a day or 2 days. And slowly, but you have to be able to turn a blind eye to what's not working and that you're not paying attention to because you're fixing something else. So you have to either walk out in the lobby while it's going on, the part of the show that you know is going to change and get fixed and isn't working. Another thing is the audience. The audience is an interesting animal. It is always right collectively and never right individually. If an audience member comes up to you and says, "Listen, why don't listen, it's wrong." It's not wrong because they're stupid. It's wrong because they don't know the show. It's their first view of it. They're also not in the profession, so they don't know what they're saying. Don't listen. But together, the audience is always right. When the audience doesn't laugh, say, "Oh, well, this is a New York show. We'll wait till we get to New York." No. Or, "It's really good. They're doing it wrong." No. If they're yawning and coughing during a scene, no. They're right. Mm-hmm. And
so these things you can only learn by actually being there and experiencing it.
Yes.
So is there a union? Are you a member of a union?
Well, it's almost a union. It's called the Dramatists Guild, which I was president of for 18 years, and I'm still on the council of. And it is the Association of American Playwrights, Librettists, as we don't like to be called, composers and lyricists. And it is almost a union. And the reason it's almost a union is because we own the copyright. It's our show. Producers do not own the copyright. We don't work for them. We lease them our show, and at the end of the production, we get it back. So they're only landlords, really, for the period of time that they are presenting it. You're very important. I mean, their entrepreneurship is very, very important. They're exploiting the show. You've written the show, and you're partners in a way. But you cannot be a union if you are, in fact, the owner of the work, and that keeps that from happening. But in all other respects, it is a union, and it provides a contract, and the members, the loyal members, of which most playwrights are, I mean, most of playwrights follow the guidelines.
Is there a fee schedule? I mean, how much can a book writer earn?
Well, there is a tradition. It's gotten a little cloudy because it used to be a share of the gross proceeds of the show. Now it's a profit pool. The profit is cut up in a certain way, but that's for agents.
Well, how much? In case somebody wants to do this, they're going to say, how much can I make doing this?
If Robert Anderson, the man who wrote Tea and Sympathy, who's never written a musical, by the way, but he has a great playwright. We have it almost on the wall as a sampler. So the theater's a place where you can make a killing, but you can't make a living. And that's very true. One show, one big hit for the rest of your life, because there is now the life of a musical after Broadway and after the First Class Road is gigantic. There's probably more money in the show from its subsidiary life, that is to say stock, amateur, foreign, all the things that go on afterwards, is every bit as remunerative as the original Broadway production.
So you can make a pretty good living.
No, you can make a fortune.
Oh, you can make a fortune.
Yeah,
well, that's
but a
appealing.
living, no. No, I'm being serious. A living, no. You've got to do something else. You need one big show or a lot of pretty good shows, but it's not.
So you do it for love, a lot of love.
Well, you do it. Why? It's the same thing writing plays. Why do you do it? That's what I do. That's my passion. That's my calling. That's it's my profession. It's not like medicine or the law where you're guaranteed a practice. You know, you write plays because you must. Otherwise, they're not worth looking at. And the same thing with musicals.
So say a person feels he or she has such a calling. Can they go to the Dramatists Guild and get an internship? Or,
no, they become members, which allows them protections. But what you must do is to go. There are two ways to do it. First of all, I would recommend that anyone really interested in the musical theater not hang around. I'm sorry I keep dumping on Cincinnati, but I wouldn't hang around outside New York. New York is where they happen. Okay. New York is where because that's where the people who know how to do it are. And there are not many people. I would say between book writers, composers, lyricists, and directors, there may be 30 people who know how to do it, which is not it sounds very small, but they know how to. There are another 30, 40 people who are involved, but have yet to manage to make it work. Very promising. We're going through a change now in the musical theater. The old collaborations have either through attrition or through breakup of teams or through whatever are not there are only two collaborations that remain: Kander and Ebb, and Steve Sondheim. But Steve being a total collaborator. Yes. But those are the only songwriting teams that really are still working together. Bach and Harnick have broken up. Most of the people are. I have done shows now because I did an original show with a Gershwin score, and I've done this Irving Berlin show, and I've done two with Richard Rodgers, and I've done Julie. I'm the only. These are being revived, and I sit there, and I'm the only actual author with a temperature over 90. And it's very strange, not to have those people there because they created so much, and they're responsible for so much. And
so you're looking for.
Well, I work with
lyricists and
Kander and Ebb
musicians.
now, and I'm working with Maury Yeston, who is a marvelous composer lyricist. We did Titanic together.
Yes.
He wrote Nine, which won the Tony, and very talented man. We're working on a show now. I'm working with a songwriter from the '60s who is still, he was very young then, so he's still a relatively young man, Jimmy Webb, who is well known. I'm working with him because he's quite interested in the theater. He did a couple of shows with Michael Bennett that were unfortunately sidetracked when Michael died, but I'm working with him. So there are people. There are also a group of young composers. There's Adam Gettle, and there's Luciuso, and there's all sorts of young, very talented composers and lyricists here.
So a person who thought they had a passion for writing it for the theater needs to hook up with a composer.
Well, get into the world.
Get into
the world of the musical, because that's where you'll learn, and that's where it'll work.
You don't think graduate school or...
I think graduate school is very important for learning how to construct a play, learning what a play is. For instance, there was a man named Francis Ferguson who wrote a book called The Idea of Theater, and in that book he described the dramatic pattern, which he called purpose, passion, perception, 3 acts. Now, drama, just like all stories, are told in 3 acts. We have intermissions now in the middle of we have only 1 intermission, but that doesn't change the fact that there are 3 acts in construction. The first act, the act of purpose, is when you meet the people, you see who they are, you get some of the backstory, a lot of the exposition, and it ends at the end of Act 1 with the act of passion beginning. That is to say, where suddenly the conflicts and the relationships go into full swing. At the end of Act 2 comes believe it or not, the climax. It comes at the end of Act 2. That is to say, an event whereby nothing will ever be the same again. Hamlet stabs Polonius through the curtain at that point. Up until then, anything was possible. Any combination of events was possible. He could have ended up very happily with Ophelia. He could have, right? But once he stabbed Polonius, the ending was put into motion, and nothing could ever be the same, and it was inevitable what happened. And that happens at the 2/3 mark, the end of the second act, the act of passion. Then comes the act of perception, where everybody discovers what they might have known in the first place, or what they've learned through this ordeal, or through this comedy, or through this whatever. And those 3 acts are fairly uniform in size. I know it sounds dogmatic, but there's some basis for it. If you take a great play and it's 90 pages long, and you turn to page 30, thereabouts, within a page or so, you'll find the end of Act 1. And the same thing around page 60, you'll find that climax, that place where it happens. The idea that you don't outline, the idea that you won't sit down and plan out, a lot of people say, I follow my muse, wherever my muse takes me. Well, your muse usually takes you to some place you don't want to be, because your muse does not necessarily have your interests at heart. The fact is that you must sit down. And I think it's one of the sins today is that a lot of the new playwrights and a lot of the great playwrights say, well, I don't like that aspect of it. I don't do it. It somehow limits me. It crimps my style. It does, I don't know, it's too technical. I don't want to do it. But I'm very much, again, in the Aristotelian concept of, I believe that he knew everything there was about writing a play.
So if you have this passion, you should read Aristotle right away.
Well, by all means, read Aristotle. If you're going to be in the theater, the poetics, just that. But that's good.
Anything else that would really help?
Well, this book by Ferguson is also, it's always in print. It's quite helpful, too.
And that was called what?
The Idea of Theater.
The Idea of Theater.
Francis Ferguson. It's a good book. But get yourselves into even if you get yourselves into an amateur musical group where you are prior to coming to New York, you will at least see the activity. You'll get to know what a musical is by working on one. And somehow the intricacies and the sophistication of how it was put together and how it, one of the things about a musical is programming. And when I say it's easier to work with the composer lyricist than to come in after or to be before them, one of the things that the collaboration has to work out is the songs, where the songs are. And usually they come if you wrote the book first. they would come and take your very best moments and turn them into songs. They would, because those are the moments that should be songs. A lot of times they're the emotional moment. Frank Leslie, I went to him, as you know, and I went to him and I said, "Where does a song go?" And he said, and I've never heard anyone else ever say this, and it made perfect sense. A song comes at that moment when words fail, when emotions force interjections. Oh, ah, e. A lot of great theaters. Oh, what a beautiful morning, right? It's where words fail, where suddenly. But a book writer has an obligation. A song is a very formal thing. It has rhyme, it has meter, it has themes, and dialogue does not. And so the job of the book writer is to do a transition between speech and lyric, and you write that. Now, it used to be the songwriters did part of the work by writing a verse. We don't have much verse today. Songwriters don't write verses much. So the verse belongs in prose to the book writer, and you elevate the dialogue, you elevate the language a little. You make it a little more poetic, not poetic enough that it's strange, but poetic enough so that when they suddenly start to sing, it's not jarring,
sure,
and it doesn't upset you. So that's something that you have to learn how to get into. Where songs go is very important, but also programming them. You can't have 3 ballads next to one another, and you can't have 2 comedy songs coming right after another. And so programming a score becomes very important. The word score is important. A lot of Hollywood composers, the best of them, Mancini and Elmer Bernstein, and they come to New York and write, but they write songs. They're not writing scores. And a score is not a collection of songs. It is a piece. It is of a fabric. And each song fits into it. And they're part of the style and part of the musical theme. And a score is not a collection of songs. And that's something that composers have to learn. But it's also that book writers must understand that when a song. Anyway, they take your dialogue if you've written it. What I say is don't write it yet.
Don't give it away.
Sit with them, and we sit. Kander, Ebb, and I sit in Fred's kitchen, and we sit there and we work out a scene. And this is what the scene is. This is what the song is. This is where the song goes. Then we go and we work alone, as writers do, and they write a song, and I write a scene, and then we come back together again and make sure that it all fits together and is part of it, and then we move ahead. And that way, you create the thing together. And the whole idea of saying, well, I'll go write the score and you go write a book is hopeless.
If a person has an idea for a book, what should they do? Do they come to the Dramatists Guild and drop it off?
No, because you can register it, but that's not the point. Obviously, you're going to have to get, if you have just a book, it shouldn't be a full book. It should be the outline of a book. It should be the treatment of a book. You have to find now, for instance, the Dramatists Guild has a musical theater program. And in that program, the NYU has a musical theater program, which is quite good. So does Juilliard. And there are many other places, the New Drama. There are places that have musical theater. ASCAP has one, and the Society of Composers and Lyricists, as does BMI, the alternate licensing group for singers. For composers and lyricists. And they have musical theater workshops, that is to say, symposia, where they play each other their own work and so forth. One of the weaknesses of those programs is there are no book writers involved in it. It is composers and lyricists, and the lyricist usually writes the book. And a lyricist, for the most part, can no more write a book than a book writer could write the lyrics. It's a different discipline. It's a different talent. There have been book writers who were lyricists. I mean, Common and Green managed it. No, not Steve. Steve does the 2. There are others.
But by and large, it's
many who have succeeded. Alan Lerner did it, but except for My Fair Lady, which was 98% George Bernard Shaw, he was not all that strong at writing books, but he did it. There were some others.
Well, there's an example of...
Oscar was the best example. Oscar Hammerstein was a master at both lyric and book, and he had both abilities. But that's like saying I'm a sculptor and a painter. There are people who are. I mean, Picasso was a sculptor and a painter. But most painters are not sculptors, and most sculptors are not painters, at least not as good as they are in their own field. Oscar was.
What is the difference between adapting something and then having the original?
Well, adapting something,
skills?
I mean, I've done both. And adapting, for instance, I'm doing it now with Maury Yeston. We're adapting an old play and film from the 20s and 30s. And you use the original as a roadmap. You take the elements of it that work. You have to change it. You must change it. You must make it your own. I did some movies. I did The Year, which had been a very successful movie, which involved a lot of work because the times had changed. With Something Like It Hot, it was a period piece to start with, and that doesn't change. With Woman of the Year, which had been a period piece in 1941, I mean, it was done in 1941 as contemporary. We decided to do it contemporary, so none of the values of the landscape were the same. And so it became quite a different situation. I've done shows that were contemporary when they were written, and when we went to do them again, we made them period pieces because we kept them in the period in which they were written. All of those things are big in adaptation.
But are there different skills required for adapting and
No,
original work, or it's the
Not
same
re-
people
well,
can do the
original-
same thing?
Writing an original play, obviously, is more difficult than
Yes.
writing an adaptation. It's harder. You have to first have an idea. Second of all, you have to know how to construct it. You have to know how to write it, and because you're working in totally unknown territory, as opposed to a roadmap. When you adapt something, you have a very strong roadmap. Otherwise, why bother? You have something that has its own construction already.
When did you know that you had this passion?
Right after this first musical, I knew I was interested. I knew that I could tell stories that I couldn't tell in straight play. I knew I could tell them in a way that didn't interest me as much. I was not interested in naturalism at all. It didn't interest me.
But you went to Yale Drama, you said, so
Yes,
you
to
knew
be a
when you were
playwright.
a
I was going to be a
teenager,
playwright.
when you were 16, 17?
When I was 10, I knew I wanted to be a playwright.
Oh,
I was
10.
born and raised in Los Angeles, in a film atmosphere, in a film family, in a film community, and I love film, and I've written 25 films. But my passion was the theater. The idea of the immediacy of it, the danger of it. I mean, it was up there, and it wasn't like a movie where you say, you know, it didn't work, you forgot his line, let's start, we'll retake. The scenery falls down, we'll retake. The danger of it, the immediacy of it, the proximity of it, I don't know, the danger of it. I keep coming back to that. When I was about 15 years old, my parents took me to see out in Los Angeles a musical of something called Louisiana Hayride, and it starred a comic named Bobby Clark, which nobody under the age of 108 remembers, but nevertheless, he was a great stage comic, and he had been in burlesque and vaudeville, and he was very big on the stage, and he had enormous skills. And at the Philharmonic, which was the only theater they had for musicals, and the stage was much too large there because it held 100 musicians playing. The scenery had to be expanded a little, and it was a very large stage, and I went to this thing, and in walked Bobby Clark, and a great entrance. The audience applauded. He had a little pork pie hat. He was distinguished for the fact that he had big glasses that were painted on. They weren't his. They were big painted on glasses. And pork pie hat. And he took off his hat, and he sailed it backhand like a Frisbee into a hat tree was standing in the corner. I mean, 100 miles away, landed on the thing. But which it did. I'm sure on occasion it missed, but it landed on it with great authority. And I said, only in the theater, you wouldn't believe it in a film. It would have been enhanced. It would have been done 50 times, or it would have been cut in the middle. It's in front of you. The danger and excitement and victory of it was so enormous at that time that I have a feeling that had a great influence on me, to want to do theater, to be live, to do something in front of a live audience.
Is it difficult to find a producer these days?
Very. That's the biggest shortage there is. The ones who are most successful are large offices that handle. This is not so interesting, but it's a fact, and that is that the economics of the theater have changed radically. It's become it's no longer possible to run with just a loyal theater audience. You have to attract an audience who is not normally a theater audience in order to make it work financially. You've got to get people through the tunnels and over the bridges and from tourists. And that's why the theater's suffering. The new plays in town are not suffering through the recent, I don't know when this will air, but we're really 2 weeks to the day after the tragedy downtown. And the theater just went absolutely out, and I mean 10%, whatever. But the plays, the new plays, were doing okay. I mean, they're doing better now. I mean, the Producers is still selling out. 42nd Street is selling out. The new plays, there's a Helen Mirren play right now,
Dance of
Dance of Death, with Ian
Holm.
Whatever. You'll look under in a minute. Anyway, it's selling out.
Yes.
But Phantom of the Opera, Les Miserables, which they've been playing for 13, 15 years, they depend entirely on out-of-towners now, because everybody in New York's seen it, at least seen part of it. And the fact is that and so tourists aren't coming, and that's affected the theater, but you need them. I mean, Titanic ran over 2 years on Broadway when we wrote that. And we had to get a new audience to come after that point. And it had to run beyond that point because it was barely making back, even as a success, having won all the Tonys and selling out. It was maybe not yet when it's returned all of its money. We needed the out-of-town audience. The out-of-town audience thought we were the movie because they weren't theater goers, you know. As a matter of fact, one woman came up and said, is Leonardo in it tonight?
Oh,
you know?
no.
Yes, unfortunately. So it's a new audience in a sense.
Yes.
And that audience is not quite as theatrically sophisticated as the New York audience, or not just New York. There are theater goers from around the country who come to New York within the first 6, 7 months who are really theater people. And it's caused the simplifying of the theater a little bit because you have to attract audiences that are moviegoers, basically.
When did you know that you had this skill, these talents?
I think it was... my third show, 1776, was an enormous success, and it was at that point I knew that I knew how to do this, and that I could do it again, and that I wanted to keep on doing it, and that was what my life would be. I was still not totally convinced that I wasn't going to be writing a play, but at that point I realized 1776 could not. People say, why didn't you do it as a straight play? It's mostly talk. There are very few songs. That it was a musical gave it a level of where we could do it. It would have been too arch as a straight play. It would have been a little bit strange as a straight play. But as a musical, somehow, though it was a very strange musical because it didn't have enormous choreography, there wasn't a lot of spectacle. But we could. Most of what was in 70 was information, but surrounded with some entertainment, surrounded with some music, surrounded with that level, and people were willing to hear it.
And at that moment, you said to yourself, this is my life, this is what I can do?
Yeah.
Is that an aha experience?
Well,
Or an uh-oh?
No, I think what happens is that it settles in as it kind of begins as a kind of confidence, which you then, you know, it's a big thing with writers. Just when they start a project, you say, "I'm never going to be able to do it. I can't do it. I'll never do it again. I can't. I don't know how." As you live long enough and keep doing it long enough, you begin to say, "Yes, I can do it. Maybe I won't do it right, or maybe it won't work, but I know how to do it." And knowing how to do it is an enormous confidence that you get. But it's again like anything else. It's doing it over and over again. I had this script. I brought it in because I was explaining that I work on a computer now exclusively. It took me a long time to get to it. I wrote longhand because I was a very good typist. I studied typing in junior high school. I'm very fast and very accurate. But I found that the way I work, I rewrite as I write. And you can't rewrite on a typewriter. You just can't do it. So I changed. I wrote for about 10 years on a typewriter. Then I changed and wrote longhand on yellow pads. And I was very reluctant to give that up. Until I got to so someone said, well, work on a computer. So I went to the computer and I said, I'll use that as a typewriter. I'll write longhand, then I'll copy it on one day that lasted.
Oh.
And from that day forward, It was so much easier and so much more efficient and so much more fun to work on the computer that I've never gone back to writing longhand again, except when I cut a script. I write very long, as most writers do, and to cut a script, you can't quite see enough of it on a monitor to cut in context. So I do that by hand, and I cut it, and I really mark it up, and then I put it on the computer.
Don't you also find that it looks different in print than on the screen? You don't find that?
Of course, quite a bit
Sometimes,
different.
I don't know, somehow
And
it looks different to
the
me.
only time I need it to look like it's in print is when I cut.
How often, how many rewrites have you done, for instance, on that?
Well, this one is our
Curtains.
9th draft. When I'm free, I'm writing a show, they're free, and we finally said, wait a minute, hold it. We're so out of sync here, let's stop and do this, so we're going to do it.
Are you a hired gun? I mean, can somebody call
No.
you up and say,
No.
write this for me?
No.
No. You decide.
On film, it's possible, but I don't like film anymore. The role of the author in film is not very nice. Right. It just isn't. It's not respectable work. They're not respected. Film writers are not respected by the producers and the directors and the stars who now run it. And you are simply a hired scribbler who will then be rewritten by somebody else and who will be rewritten by somebody else, and you end up with a hodgepodge that you don't recognize. It's not yours. The money's good. But if you care, if you're a proprietor, if you really care about your work, it's terribly demeaning work. And I stopped doing it a couple of years ago. I wrote, as I say, over 2 dozen films.
Well, you've won an Oscar, you've won an Emmy, you've won a Tony. You've been honored.
But the Oscar part was, at a time, it was a little easier to do. You know, it's funny, there was a time when it was an original screenplay, of which there were almost none. Now it's almost switched. They're almost all original and very few adaptations.
But you wouldn't be hired to write something
Well, you're never
for the
hired.
theater either.
You're never hired in the first place, since you own it. So you're
Okay.
never hired. There's no,
Okay.
which is part of the good part. Yes, a producer will call up and say, we're going to do this. Are you interested? I've got these 2 composers.
Right.
Are you interested? Well, I'd like to sit down and talk. I find that most of the work we've done over the past 20 years has been, we have generated ourselves. And then what we like to do now, because we can afford it a little more than we could, is theater is still a place where you work without any remuneration at all. There is no money until you get it on the stage and it starts going. So there is a great risk involved. When you get to a producer, he will give you an advance, and that advance is gotten better over the years, and it's enough that
How much is an advance?
Well, on a
usually?
musical, the advance plus the rest of it that goes together is somewhere around $78,000 at the present time, which split 3 ways. But that's still enough to get you to sit and write another play, you know, without having to take work in a waiting table in a restaurant or in a bookstore. So that part of it has improved, but it's very risky work. Again, part of the risk is, again, part of the excitement of it all, but still. But we like to finish the show, then we even get a director before we go to a producer, because the producers today are not the producers that used to be. They're not quite as, they're not entirely men who are excited by the theater. They're really more excited by the hit.
Or the money.
Which
Or
is
the
same
bottom
thing.
line, yeah.
Yeah.
So they're not as creative. So
No.
on your team, you would get the director first. How important is the director to your book?
Very important to the whole show. Unlike straight play, where he's very important, he's much more important than a musical, because someone has to be in charge, more than a play. Well, a play, it's you and the author and the director, and that's enough. You'll sit and battle it out. But on a musical, there are so many collaborative parts, as we said. There are choreographers, and there are designers of different, and you need one captain, and someone who will run it all, someone who will, when you're out there in the middle of it all, is the final word on all of this.
You have to be able to argue, though, for yourself,
A
don't
lot,
you?
a lot.
Is that one of the qualities
And you have
need?
contractual protection. No one may change a line, a word. No one can add it, change it, subtract it without your permission. Oh. They can't hire an actor without your permission. They cannot hire a director without your permission. Approval, not permission. so that the author he owns it. So therefore, it's his. It's like you own your house. No one come and paint it without you saying, "That's the painter I want. I don't want this fellow because he's a splatterer."
So you have quite a bit of control.
Yes, indeed, and that's the Dramatists Guild.
Ah,
That's what that's provided, and the Dramatists Guild is remarkably important and necessary.
and how does one join the Dramatists
Call
Guild?
up and join, but you have to be a playwright. And
Well, how do you say? Can you call up and say, I'm trying to be a
I've written a play, and I want to be a member. Well, why would you want to be a member if you didn't write plays?
No, but this is.
But if you want to write plays, yes, you call up and be a member. You become an associate member, which is not the final status. You graduate to active membership, which has to do with you've had a play produced in a commercial venue. It doesn't have to be on Broadway. It can be off Broadway, and the regional theaters are very, very important today. That's where not so much musicals, but that's where the theater really starts today. Is in the through the regional process.
If you had to advise a young person who was interested in a career in writing for the theater, what would you suggest?
Well, I would say study it, first of all, either pre-graduate or postgraduate. Study it, postgraduate if you can afford it, if you have the time. Then hang around a theater. One of the most important things I learned at Yale when I was in the graduate school there, getting a master's, were the other disciplines. The other disciplines at this particular series of telecasts are going to be sound and scenery and acting and directing and lighting. Very important to understand all of that. Be an actor, even though you have no interest or talent for it, just to see what the experience is, because otherwise you have to deal with actors. And if you don't understand what they're going through, if you don't understand what it means to be up there, I mean, an actor will say, "I can't say that." They say, "Oh, shut up and say it." But once you've tried acting and you know that there's something to it, if they can't say it, you got to deal with it.
Right.
Either get a new actor or deal with the one you have, and say, "Well, there's a reason why you can't say it. What is it?" "Well, it's too complicated. It's not my whatever." You can argue it out, but in the final run, it has to be dealt with.
Did you ever want to be an actor?
Never.
No?
I mean, sublimating your own personality to somebody else's, and I've never done that. No, it doesn't interest me, and I don't think I have any ability for it. And what the world doesn't need is another bad actor.
Particularly when we have such a good musical book writer.
Well, I hope so.
Thank you so much for sharing this information. You gave us a whole course here, so I thank you.
Well, I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. We've been talking with musical book writer Peter Stone. For the American Theater Wing, I'm Pia Lindström.
The American Theater Wing's Guide to Careers in the Theater is a project of the American Theater Wing and the New York Public Library's Billy Rose Theater Collection, Theater on Film and Tape Archive.